Hello everybody and welcome to my channel. My name is Christoph and today I want to do a bonus round of Rings of Power, but don't be afraid, there will be no Rings of Power content in here. I just thought it would be a really nice idea to just go through some lines of the book, The Lord of the Rings, and maybe some more, and see what details are actually in there, because that is the stuff that they licensed, and what possible lines they could have actually violated with changing so much. So, just going through this book, you will find in the prologue some things that is said about hobbits. For example, it is clear nonetheless from these legends and from the evidence of their peculiar words and customs that, like many other folks, Hobbit had in the distant past moved westwards. So they do hint some of these ideas about wandering, but they also say that this probably happened in the Third Age. Then we come to a very interesting part. The Harfoots had much to do with the dwarves in ancient times, and long lived in the foothills of the mountains. They moved westward early, and roamed over Eriador as far as Weathertop, while the others were still in Wilderland. They were the most normal and representative variety of hobbit, and far the most numerous. They were the most inclined to settle in one place, and longest preserved their ancestral habit of living in tunnels and holes. I think that is a violated line in the book. What else do we have here? So, we have learned in the Rings of Power that Celeborn has somehow disappeared or died. In the chapter in Lorien, it is said, "The Lord of the Galadrim is accounted the wisest of the elves of Middle-earth, and a giver of gifts beyond the power of kings. He has dwelt in the west since the days of dawn, and I have dwelt with him for years uncounted." So, so much about that. Most of the other details are in the appendices, and that is why Amazon paid so much money to get the license for these appendices, and together with the main part of the Lord of the Rings. So let's see what of this stuff they actually used. When we come to Númenor, we know that the Queen Miriel is shown. King Inziladun repented of the ways of the kings and changed his name to Tar Palantir, the Farsighted. His daughter should have been the fourth queen, Tar Miriel, but the king's nephews usurped the scepter and became Ar-Pharazôn the Golden, last king of Númenor. So Miriel was never regent queen. Okay, another part about the Númenóreans at the time of the second half of the Second Age. At first the Númenóreans had come to Middle-earth as teachers and friends of lesser men afflicted by Sauron. But now their havens became fortresses, holding wide coastlands in subjection. Atanamir and his successors levied heavy tribute, and the ships of the Númenóreans returned laden with spoil, which unfortunately we didn't see anywhere in the series. The power and wealth of the Númenórean nonetheless continued to increase, but their years lessened as their fear of death grew, and their joy departed. Tar Palantir attempted to amend the evil, but it was too late, and there was rebellion and strife in Númenor. We saw that one angry mob because of working conditions. When he died, his nephew, leader of the rebellion, seized the scepter and became King Ar-Pharazôn. That might happen in the next season because the king just died, but I mean, yeah, he never gave up power when he was older. Now we come to the funny part of the Tale of the Years, because they give you so much data of the timeline of the Lord of the Rings and all the other ages in Middle-earth. This is basically what the appendices are about. This is the reason why you would want to get all to pay for getting to license this, because then you have all the information instead of just guesswork. Later some of the Noldor went to Eregion upon the west of the Misty Mountains and near to the west gate of Moria. This they did because they learned that Mithril had been discovered in Moria. The Noldor were great craftsmen and less unfriendly to the dwarves than the Sindar. But the friendship that grew up between the people of Durin and the elven smith of Eregion was the closest that there ever had been between the two races. Celebrimbor was lord of Eregion and the greatest of the craftsmen. He was descended from Fëanor. So the last part is not too bad, but obviously they moved to Moria after they had learned that Mithril was there. There wasn't already a city there, and they weren't so close to Moria without ever having had dealings with the dwarves. Now, going through the year count in the Second Age, you find nice dates such as the year circa 1000 Second Age. Sauron, alarmed by the growing power of the Númenóreans, chooses Mordor as a land to make into a stronghold. He begins the building of Barad-dûr. This is 600 years before the forging of the Rings of Power. Mordor is already existing. Circa 1600, Sauron forges the One Ring in Orodruin. He completes the Barad-dûr. Celebrimbor perceives the designs of Sauron. That is when the rings were forged. And then, now we have to jump towards the end of the Second Age, because that is when the Númenórean part of the story actually existed. As I said in my reactions, about 1,500 years after the forging of the Rings of Power. 3175, Repentance of Tar Palantir, Civil War in Númenor. And then later, Ar-Pharazôn the Golden seizes the scepter. Then we come to the Third Age, and of course, none of the stories that was shown was actually shown as being in the Third Age, but a lot of stuff that they showed would happen much later in the Third Age. For example, when maybe 1,000 years had passed and the first shadow had fallen on Greenwood the Great, the Istari or wizards appeared in Middle-earth. It was afterwards said that they came out of the far west and were messengers sent to contest the power of Sauron and to unite all those who had the will to resist him. But they were forbidden to match his power with power, or to seek to dominate elves or men by force and fear. That is one of the reasons why Gandalf so rarely showed his power in The Lord of the Rings. Círdan saw further and deeper than any other in Middle-earth, and he welcomed Mithrandir when he arrived in the Grey Havens, knowing whence he came and whither he would return. "Take this ring, master," he said, "for your labours will be heavy, but it will support you in the weariness that you have taken upon yourself. For this is the ring of fire, and with it you may rekindle hearts in a world that grows chill." So the Rings of Power already existed, and Círdan saw Gandalf arrive from the west by ship, and he then gave him one of the 3 Rings of Power. So now when we look at the year 1050 of the Third Age, this is 3,000 years now after Sauron went to Mordor, there is the note, the Perianath are first mentioned in records with the coming of the Harfoots to Eriador. And then 1100, the Wise, the Istari and the Chief Eldar discover that an evil power has made a stronghold at Dol Guldur. So we are suddenly jumping towards stories that are mentioned in The Hobbit, even though The Hobbit is also heavily incorrect regarding the chronology of the Third Age. So we notice that a lot of evil people, also in The Hobbit, they all talk black speech. And there's also the word of Uruk that is mentioned by Ada. Orc is the form of the name that other races have for this foul people, as it was in the language of Rohan. In Sindarin it was Orch. Related, no doubt, was the word Uruk of the black speech, though this was applied as a rule only to the great soldier orcs that at this time issued from Mordor and Isengard. The lesser kinds were called, especially by the Uruk-hai, Snaga. So it should be clear that this has nothing to do with enslaved elves. It is said that the black speech was devised by Sauron in the Dark Years, and that he had desired to make it the language of all those that served him, but he failed in that purpose. And that's it for the licensed material. Now, if you are interested, you may want to continue to see what is happening in other published books. I'm not going through all the books that contain manuscripts of Tolkien, but I am going to continue with the one properly published, continuous and coherent story, that is the Silmarillion, which was later published after Tolkien's death by his son. There are 2 chapters which deal with the Third Age and the Rings of Power, the Rings of Power and the Third Age in that chronology, and Númenor. So let's see what happened at the end of the First Age. Among the elves that lingered in Middle-earth were Círdan the shipwright and Celeborn of Doriath, with Galadriel his wife, who alone remained of those who led the Noldor to exile in Beleriand. So much for that. What do we have here? We're talking about Númenor now. And Sauron hated the Númenóreans because of the deeds of their fathers and their ancient alliance with the elves and allegiance to the Valar. Nor did he forget the aid that Tar Minastir had rendered to Gil-galad of old, in that time when the One Ring was forged and there was war between Sauron and the elves in Eriador. So we're looking back from the perspective of the later kings of Númenor towards things that happened 1,000 years ago when the rings were forged. But when Inziladun acceded to the scepter, he took again a title in the elven tongue as of old, calling himself Tar Palantir, for he was far-sighted both in eye and in mind, and even those that hated him feared his words as those of a true seer. So much for the frail old man that was depicted in the show. For Pharazôn, son of Gimechat, had become a man yet more restless and eager for wealth and power than his father. He had fared often abroad as a leader in the wars that the Númenóreans made then in the coastlands of Middle-earth, seeking to extend their dominion over men, and thus he had won great renown as a captain both by land and by sea. I am afraid this is not quite depicted in the series. And it came to pass that Tar-Palantir grew weary of grief and died. He had no son, but a daughter only, whom he named Miriel in the elven tongue, and to her now by right and the laws of the Númenóreans came the scepter. But Pharazôn took her to wife against her will, doing evil in this, and evil also in that the laws of Númenor did not permit the marriage, even in the royal house, of those more nearly akin than cousins in the second degree. I mean, this makes sense. What else do we have here? The chief among the faithful, to whom they looked for leading and courage in evil days, was Amandil, counsellor of the king, and his son Elendil, whose sons were Isildur and Anarion, then young men by the reckoning of Númenor. Amandil and Elendil were great ship captains, and they were of the line of Elros Tar-Miniatur, though not of the ruling house to whom belonged the crown and the throne in the city of Armelenos. In the days of their youth together, Amandil had been dear to Pharazôn, and though he was of the elf friends, he remained in his council until the coming of Sauron. This was completely ignored, which is fair because they didn't license it, but still, they could have just shown Amandil. Now, we are jumping to the next chapter, which begins again by an introduction of the general story. When Thangorodrim was broken and Morgoth overthrown, Sauron put on his fair hue again and did obeisance to Eonwe, the herald of Manwë, and abjured all his evil deeds. And some hold that this was not at first falsely done, but that Sauron in truth repented, if only out of fear, being dismayed by the fall of Morgoth and the great wrath of the lords of the West. Then Sauron was ashamed, and he was unwilling to return in humiliation to receive from the Valar a sentence, it might be, of long servitude in proof of his good faith, for under Morgoth his power had been great. Therefore, when Eonwe departed, he hid himself in Middle-earth, and he fell back into evil, for the bonds that Morgoth had laid upon him were very strong. This really does not seem as if he waited for 1,000 years until the forging of the rings to become evil, but rather that he had been evil quite shortly after the fall of Morgoth. Seeing the desolation in the world, Sauron said in his heart that the Valar, having overthrown Morgoth, had again forgotten Middle-earth, and his pride grew apace. He looked with hatred on the Eldar, and he feared the men of Númenor, who came back at whiles in their ships to the shores of Middle-earth. But for long he dissembled his mind and concealed the dark designs that he shaped in his heart. And then Sauron said, For a mighty king is Gil-galad, and wise in all lore is Master Elrond, and yet they will not aid me in my labours. Can it be that they do not desire to see other lands become as blissful as their own? But wherefore should Middle-earth remain forever desolate and dark, whereas the elves could make it as fair as Eressëa, nay, even Valinor? And since you have not returned thither as you might, I perceive that you love this Middle-earth as I do. So the idea and the seduction of the elves, from the Sauron's point of view, but also from what is known in the lore, is that the elves wanted to make Middle-earth as beautiful and long-lasting, and also feeling the burden of the progress of time less, just as it is in Valinor, the Undying Lands, where time passes slowly and there's no decay. So that was actually what they wanted to do back then. But Sauron, finding that he was betrayed and that the elves were not deceived, was filled with wrath, and he came against them with open war, demanding that all the rings should be delivered to him. All the rings, many, right? Since the elven smiths could not have attained to their making without his lore and counsel. But the elves fled from him, and 3 of the rings they saved, and bore them away and hid them. Therefore the 3 remained unsullied, for they were forged by Celebrimbor alone. And the hand of Sauron had never touched them, and yet they were also subject to the One. I find it also very important that the whole forging of the ring, which is the main point of the whole show, is really jumbled up in what happened when and what happened after what. And then we come to the final point that I marked. Let's see what this is about. Yeah, of course. Even as the first shadows were felt in Mirkwood, we're talking about the Third Age here, there appeared in the west of Middle-earth the Istari, whom men called the Wizards. None knew at that time whence they were, save Círdan at the havens, and only to Elrond and to Galadriel did he reveal that they came over the sea. Yeah, I think we had that in the appendix already, but it's reinforced by other text. Okay, so what teaches that us? They really didn't care about anything, and they could have gotten much more material from the stuff that they had actually licensed, and they could have gotten even more if they would have just cared about the general idea that is behind the lore, which is just hinted in many places slightly, and you have to collect more of this general framework to understand what is implicitly shown in many of these scenes, either in the book or in the movies. So you want to understand that obviously the Halfwoods were not migrating throughout all of Middle-earth for whatever fun they had 3,000 years before anybody had ever heard of them. And you would also understand that the wizards were not just running around throwing magic to hobbits or Halfwoods thousands of years before they existed and fall out of the sky as a meteorite. This is all just, yeah, it's just so frustrating. There's absolutely no reason, in my opinion, for how this could be excused, and I find it especially annoying because since watching the end of the season, I did actually read some interviews from the showrunners, trying to understand what arguments they have, and they don't really have any arguments except saying that they looked into the books again and again to make sure that they were accurate in detail, and they were following Tolkien so close, and there were so much fans of Tolkien and all this stuff, which just cannot be true if they changed so much, despite of how precisely all these things are knitted in there. With that, I would like to close this video, and then we also close the chapter of the Rings of Power. And if I ever do another video again, it will be about something slightly more cheerful, I hope. See you then, and bye bye.